Look at the person sitting across from you. If you know exactly how to read the microexpressions flashing across their face, you aren't just observing them, you are absorbing them. Most people believe that an empath's ultimate breaking point is an explosion of tears, a screaming match, or a dramatic door-slamming exit. They are entirely wrong. That is what amateur behaviorists expect. The true point of no return is completely silent. It is a sudden, absolute drop in atmospheric pressure inside the room. It is the moment an empath looks directly into your eyes, sees the exact mechanism of your manipulation, and decides, with total clinical calm, that you no longer exist in their operational reality. In the next few minutes, we are going to dissect the specific behavioral threshold that an empath will never, under any circumstances, forgive. We aren't talking about ordinary hurt or standard relationship conflict. We are uncovering a hardwired psychological circuit breaker. If you are an empath, understanding this mechanism is the single most critical asset you have for self-preservation. It is the difference between being a perpetual casualty of emotional predators and becoming completely immune to their tactics. If you are the one pulling the strings, thinking you can always cycle back through the same apology loop, you need to listen very carefully. You are playing a high-stakes game with an expiration date you cannot see. There is a precise line where an empath's neurological intake shifts from emotional processing to pure, objective behavioral profiling. Once they cross that line, no amount of gaslighting, love bombing, or calculated vulnerability will ever grant you access to their psychological perimeter again. They won't hate you. Hate takes energy. They will simply look through you as if you are a pane of glass. We are going to break down the three distinct phases of this behavioral shutdown, the hidden physical tells that signal it's happening in real time, and the one specific transgression that permanently seals the door. If you leave this video early, you will miss the exact behavioral markers that tell you whether a relationship is salvageable or if the psychological ink has already dried. Let's look at the data. Every human being operates on a predictable set of behavioral baselines. We establish patterns, we build comfort zones, and we signal our boundaries through subtle, non-verbal cues. But when we look at the psychological architecture of a highly empathetic individual, the rules change entirely. An empath doesn't just navigate the world, they map it, using an advanced sensory array that reads micro-expressions, vocal tonality, and autonomic shifts in everyone around them. This level of environmental scanning requires an immense amount of internal energy. Because of this, an empath will tolerate a staggering amount of baseline deviation from the people they care about. They will rationalize your stress, excuse your bad habits, and absorb your toxicity until a very specific psychological circuit flips. This is the point of no return. And once this circuit is broken, the operational reality of the relationship is permanently altered. To understand why an empath never forgives this threshold, we have to look at how they process betrayal. When a standard emotional infraction occurs, an argument, a white lie, a momentary lapse in judgment, the empath experiences an spike in cortisol and adrenaline. They engage, they try to fix, heal, and recalibrate the connection. This emotional reactivity is exactly what manipulators rely on. It is the currency of the toxic relationship loop. But the point of no return doesn't look like an argument. The moment an empath crosses the threshold, their autonomic nervous system shifts from hypervigilance to absolute, unshakable stillness. The internal echo stops. The emotional data they have been absorbing for months or years suddenly crystallizes into cold, objective behavioral observation. They stop seeing you through the lens of their potential to fix you, and they start seeing you exactly as you are, a high-risk asset with zero return on investment. What is the exact trigger for this shutdown? It isn't the scale of the lie, it is the intent behind it. The single thing an empath will never forgive is the weaponization of their own vulnerability against them to enforce compliance. When an empath opens up to you, they are handing you the exact schematics of their psychological architecture. They are showing you where the walls are thin and where the foundation is sensitive. A manipulator takes these schematics and files them away for future leverage. The moment you use a piece of deeply personal data that the empath trusted you with, a childhood trauma, a core insecurity, a profound fear, and you inject it into a conversation to make them doubt their own sanity, to make them back down, or to force their compliance, the game is over. In that exact microsecond, the empath's brain registers a fatal breach of security. The psychological cost of maintaining the connection immediately exceeds their capacity to tolerate it. When this boundary is crossed, the empath undergoes what we call behavioral erasure. If you are watching for the physical tells of this shift, look for the sudden absence of microexpressions. The head tilts stop. The empathetic nodding disappears. Their blinking rate slows down, and their vocal tone drops into a flat, measured baseline. They are no longer operating in the emotional theater. They have moved into the control room. They will not scream. They will not levy accusations. They will simply look at you, assess the threat vector you present, and quietly remove your authorization to access their inner world. You can attempt the standard recovery protocols. You can try to deploy calculated vulnerability, historical nostalgia, or intense charm, but none of it will register. Why? Because the empath is no longer decoding your words. They are analyzing your tactics in real time. To them, your voice has become nothing more than acoustic noise. The point of no return is a beautiful, terrifying evolutionary mechanism. It is the moment the lamb realizes it has the exact same optical capacity as the wolf and simply chooses to walk out of the forest. If you have enjoyed the unearned privilege of an empath's patience, do not mistake their silence for weakness or compliance. It is the diagnostic phase of a permanent eviction. Once they decide that your presence requires more psychological defense than they are willing to expend, the door doesn't just close, the doorway itself ceases to exist. Protect your perimeter, observe the baselines, and remember, some thresholds, once crossed, leave no tracks back home. The architecture of the blank space represents the ultimate evolutionary adaptation within the highly sensitive psyche, a profound pivot from passive absorption to absolute psychological immunization. To understand this phenomenon, we must first dismantle the prevailing cultural myth that empathy is a soft, fragile, or purely emotional vulnerability. In reality, a genuine empath operates with a highly calibrated, continuous sensory intake system. Their neurology is constantly running background diagnostics on the environment, mapping microexpressions, decoding vocal frequencies, and registering the subtle autonomic shifts of the people around them. They possess an incredibly high threshold for environmental and interpersonal noise, absorbing and rationalizing toxic behavioral deviations because their system is engineered to heal and reconcile friction. However, this massive operational intake requires immense psychological bandwidth. Because the empath spends so much energy maintaining a state of high openness, their subconscious mind establishes a hidden, catastrophic circuit breaker designed for absolute self-preservation. When a predator or manipulator repeatedly abuses this openness, pushing the empath past their absolute threshold, the response is not a chaotic emotional explosion. An explosion requires engagement. It utilizes energy, fires adrenaline, and keeps the empath locked into the manipulator's transactional loop. Instead, the empath's psychological architecture undergoes a sudden, cold phase shift into what behaviorists recognize as the blank space. In a fraction of a second, the internal emotional processing unit completely detaches from the sensory intake array. The empath continues to observe the manipulator, but they are no longer absorbing them. The emotional resonance drops to absolute zero, replaced instantaneously by a clinical, unshakable indifference. The manipulator's words, tears, gaslighting tactics, and frantic attempts at love bombing no longer register as psychological threats or emotional appeals. They are downgraded to mere acoustic noise and predictable behavioral metrics. The blank space is a state of psychological erasure so absolute that the target is effectively stripped of their human identity within the empath's reality. It is a total revocation of authorization. If you look closely at the behavioral mechanics during this shift, you will see a chilling drop in the empath's physiological reactivity. Their pupils may slightly dilate as they move into pure observation mode. Their posture stabilizes, and the expressive micro-behaviors that once signaled warmth or distress completely vanish. They look directly through the manipulator, treating them not with hatred or anger, but with the empty neutrality one reserves for a blank wall or a pane of glass. The manipulator, accustomed to feeding on the empath's emotional reactions, suddenly finds themselves starved of feedback, screaming into a vacuum. Every tactic that used to guarantee a specific emotional payload now bounces off a flawless, impenetrable surface. The empath has not just built a wall, they have fundamentally altered the geography of their mind so that the space the manipulator once occupied no longer exists. This is not a temporary silent treatment or a calculated manipulation tactic used to gain leverage in a relationship dynamic. It is a permanent neurological rewrite. Once the architecture of the blank space activates, the psychological footprint of the offender is systematically dissolved, rendering it biologically and emotionally impossible for the empath to ever grant that individual entry into their inner perimeter again. The de-escalation of the internal echo marks the precise neurological pivot where an empath's internal reward loop permanently detaches from the manipulator's behavioral cycle. To fully grasp this transition, one must examine the hidden mechanics of how a highly empathetic individual processes interpersonal trauma. In the standard life cycle of a toxic relationship, the empath operates in a state of continuous psychological resonance. Every accusation, every cold shoulder, and every erratic shift in the manipulator's baseline sends a shockwave through the empath's nervous system. This is the internal echo, a relentless, exhausting loop of self-analysis, emotional processing, and hypervigilance, where the empath constantly attempts to decode the manipulator's hidden motives and heal the rift. The manipulator relies entirely on this echo. It is the emotional fuel that keeps the empath compliant, reactive, and hopelessly invested. Because the empath's brain fires mirror neurons at an accelerated rate, they literally experience the simulated pain and chaos of the offender within their own biology. This creates a powerful, albeit destructive, neurological feedback loop, where the empath feels a compulsive need to fix the external problem just to silence the internal agony. However, the human nervous system cannot sustain hypervigilance indefinitely without experiencing a structural collapse or an adaptive rewrite. The de-escalation occurs not when the empath decides to leave, but when the neurological system reaches absolute saturation and simply shuts down the echo chamber. In an instant, the internal reward loop stops firing in response to the manipulator's behavior. The chemical craving to fix, appease, or understand the toxic partner vanishes. This is the exact moment emotional data transforms into cold, objective, baseline observation. When the echo de-escalates, the empath's brain shifts its operational processing from the emotional limbic system directly to the analytical prefrontal cortex. The manipulator's actions are suddenly stripped of their emotional weight and are viewed through the unyielding lens of pure behavioral profiling. If the manipulator raises their voice, throws a calculated tantrum, or deploys a victim narrative, the empath no longer feels the familiar pang of guilt or anxiety. Instead, they observe the pitch of the voice, the artificiality of the posture, and the structural weakness of the narrative. They see the manipulation not as a personal assault, but as a predictable mechanical sequence of events executed by a deeply flawed subject. The internal mirror neurons go completely dark regarding that specific individual. This sudden absence of internal resonance creates a profound sense of clarity. The fog of gaslighting evaporates instantly because there's no longer an internal emotional echo for the manipulation to latch onto. The empath begins to read the offender with the cold detachment of a behaviorist analyzing a subject behind a one-way mirror. Every frantic attempt by the manipulator to reignite the old dynamic by escalating their behavior or staging an emotional crisis fails completely. The empath stands entirely still, immune to the chaos, because the internal mechanism that once translated that chaos into personal pain has been permanently decommissioned. The relationship loses its narrative power and is reduced to a set of sterile data points, marking a transition that is entirely invisible to the outside world, but represents an irreversible evolutionary leap within the empath's mind. The concept of the unforgivable transgression hinges entirely on the strategic exploitation of weaponized vulnerability, marking the absolute baseline breach within an empath's psychological perimeter. To comprehend why this specific infraction triggers an immediate and permanent system shutdown, we must first look at the currency of trust from a behavioral profiling perspective. When an empath enters a relationship, they do not merely share data, they grant the other person an unencrypted backdoor into their deepest psychological architecture. They intentionally hand over the exact schematics of their past traumas, their core insecurities, their emotional triggers, and the specific fears that shape their internal narrative. In the hands of a healthy individual, this data is treated as a high-security asset to be protected. However, a manipulator approaches this information with a radically different intent, cataloging these vulnerabilities not out of intimacy, but as strategic leverage to be filed away and deployed at a later date when compliance or control is required. The definitive threshold is crossed the exact moment the manipulator decides to pull one of these deeply personal data points out of the archive and deliberately injects it into a conflict to enforce submission or induce self-doubt. This is not a standard emotional outburst or a reckless insult born out of frustration. It is a calculated, tactical strike aimed directly at the empath's psychological foundational pillars. For example, if an empath confides a childhood fear of abandonment or a specific professional insecurity in a moment of absolute trust, and the manipulator later weaponizes that exact vulnerability during an argument to make the empath feel unstable, irrational, or entirely dependent, the line is crossed permanently. The empath's sensory intake system instantly recognizes the malice behind the action. It is the realization that the vulnerability was not just ignored, but actively studied, mapped, and weaponized for psychological warfare. In that single microsecond, the entire relationship dynamic undergoes a catastrophic structural failure. The empath's brain shifts out of its natural tendency to rationalize or excuse the behavior because the intent behind the transgression is completely undeniable. It becomes a fatal security breach that makes future coexistence a mathematical impossibility. The empath realizes that every moment of genuine connection was actually an espionage mission, a gathering of intelligence to be used against them. This realization bypasses the emotional processing centers entirely and triggers an instinctive, survival-driven containment protocol. The trust is not simply damaged. The entire framework that allowed trust to exist is utterly obliterated. Even if the manipulator attempts to backpedal, claiming it was a slip of the tongue or a reaction in the heat of the moment, the clinical reality remains unchanged. The empath has seen the weapon in the manipulator's hand and has registered the willingness to fire it. Because an empath's survival dictates that they cannot allow an active threat to possess the master keys to their psychological infrastructure, the system immediately revokes all access privileges permanently. The weaponized data point becomes the final monument of the relationship, a clear and chilling indicator that the person across from them is a hostile entity disguised as a partner. The ghosting neurological shift represents the definitive biological shutdown of an empath's emotional investment, an internal phenomenon that completely overrides standard psychological recovery patterns. In ordinary relationship friction, a betrayal or a severe argument triggers an immediate aggressive spike in stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. This hormonal surge forces the individual into a state of hypervigilance, driving them to fight, argue, weep, or obsessively seek resolution. This high-energy emotional reactivity is precisely what keeps a victim tethered to a toxic loop, as the brain remains highly engaged and chemically addicted to the chaotic cycle of conflict and reconciliation. However, when an empath reaches the genuine point of no return, their neurology bypasses this entire standard behavioral matrix. Instead of experiencing an escalation of anger or distress, the empath's autonomic nervous system undergoes an immediate, profound drop in emotional cortisol. This rapid internal stabilization is the biological equivalent of pulling the master plug on a massive computer server. The intense emotional noise that previously flooded the empath's brain goes completely silent in a matter of milliseconds. This shift is not a conscious choice or a calculated psychological strategy. It is an involuntary, survival-driven neurological circuit breaker. The empath moves instantly from a state of agonizing hypervigilance to a baseline of absolute, unshakable indifference. To an outside observer, or to the manipulator standing across from them, this shift can be profoundly disorienting. There is no dramatic climax, no screaming match, and no physical display of rage. The physical tells are subtle but absolute. The empath's heart rate slows down to a resting state, their breathing stabilizes, and the micro-expressions of pain or anxiety completely vanish from their face. They are no longer burning cognitive or emotional fuel to process the manipulator's presence. Anger requires an immense amount of metabolic energy. It demands that the brain remain actively engaged with the threat vector, analyzing it and reacting to it. Indifference, however, requires zero energy. When the ghosting neurological shift occurs, the brain permanently reclassifies the manipulator from a significant, highly relevant figure in their life to a sterile, non-threatening piece of environmental background data. The manipulator's words, tears, or frantic attempts to provoke a reaction no longer register as emotional stimuli. The empath's brain simply stops decoding the emotional subtext of the interaction, processing the manipulator's frantic behavior with the exact same clinical detachment one would use to watch a leaf blowing down the street. This sudden biological freeze entirely neutralizes the manipulator's toolkit, because all forms of psychological manipulation, whether gaslighting, guilt-tripping, or love-bombing, require an emotional receptor on the part of the victim to function. When the cortisol drops and the neurological shift solidifies, those receptors are permanently decommissioned. The empath can sit in the exact same room with the person who broke their trust, looking directly into their eyes, and feel absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow stillness. The internal mirror neurons that once forced the empath to absorb and experience the manipulator's emotions have gone completely dark, leaving behind a flawless behavioral immunity that cannot be pierced by any future tactics or appeals. The finality of behavioral erasure is the structural closing of the psychological ledger, an absolute state of relational termination from which no human baseline can recover. To understand this terminal phase, we must look at the human mind as an information processing system that relies on predictive coding. Throughout a relationship, the empath's brain builds a complex, high-resolution internal model of the other person, assigning them a massive amount of psychological relevance, emotional weight, and narrative priority. When the absolute threshold is crossed, and the previous neurological shifts take hold, this internal model does not simply get filed away as a bad memory. It undergoes a systematic, structural deconstruction. The psychological circuit flips, and once that biological switch moves from active engagement to total neutrality, it is completely impossible to reset. The manipulator often operates under the illusion that human emotions are cyclical, believing that because anger eventually cools, an empath's indifference will eventually soften back into warmth. They fail to realize that this is not anger. Anger is a live wire, crackling with energy and potential connection. Behavioral erasure is the complete removal of the wire from the wall. The manipulator is no longer viewed as a threat to be managed, a partner to be salvaged, or an enemy to be hated. They are systematically downgraded to a state of absolute statistical irrelevance. They become a ghost in their own environment, stripped of the power to evoke a single ripple of emotional resonance. If you analyze the behavioral mechanics of this final phase, the shift manifests as a total cessation of relational tracking. The empath completely stops monitoring the manipulator's baseline, stops reading their micro-expressions, and stops calculating their motives. The offender's entire psychological profile is wiped from the empath's active matrix, rendering their subsequent actions entirely meaningless. If the manipulator attempts to deploy their historical leverage, referencing past intimacy or shared experiences to spark a sense of guilt, the words fall entirely flat, because the historical context itself has been decoupled from the empath's current reality. The empath looks at the offender and sees a stranger executing a highly predictable script. There is no desire for revenge, no lingering resentment, and no need for closure, because closure implies that there is still a file open that needs to be stamped. In behavioral erasure, the file itself is shredded. The empath can interact with the individual out of sheer logistical necessity, perhaps in a workplace or a shared social setting, with a polite, glassy professionalism that is far more terrifying than coldness. This surface-level politeness is a flawless behavioral shield. It is the ultimate indicator that the person has been entirely evicted from the empath's emotional perimeter. The manipulator is left clawing at a smooth glass surface, unable to find a single crack or emotional handhold to reestablish the dynamic. Every psychological leverage point they once possessed has been entirely neutralized, because the receptor sites within the empath's consciousness have been permanently rewritten. The boundary is not a line drawn in the sand that can be washed away by a tide of apologies.